Welcome to WitchLit, a place to talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Raschke, author, publisher, witch, and nosy Scorpio. WitchLit is brought to you by Thousand Bolt Press, a family-owned independent publisher established to produce the books we want to see in the world. Titles including Changing Past by Yvonne Abarrow, Conjuring the Commonplace by Lane Fuller and Corey Thomas Hutchison, and my latest book, Verona Green, can be purchased directly from thousandvoltpress.com or wherever you buy books. Enfys J. Book is the author of the Gold Cover Award-winning Queer Kabbalah, Non-Binary, Gender Fluid, Omnisexual Mysticism and Magic, Llewellyn, 2022, and co-author with Ivo Dominguez Jr. of the forthcoming Sagittarius Witch, Llewellyn, 2024. And I will say, it may already be out by the time you listen to this. They are a non-binary bisexual clergy member with the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel and the High Priest of the Fellowship of the Ancient White Stag Coven near Washington, D.C. Enfys has been studying Kabbalah since 2012 and teaching in-person and online classes on magical practice since 2015, including presenting at the Sacred Space Conference, PaganaCon, the Goddess Conference, Convocation, and several local events in the Washington, D.C. area. They are also the creator of MajorAreQueerna.com, a website devoted to queer magical practice with a focus on Kabbalah, and host a podcast called 4 Quick Cues, Book Talk with Enfys, where they interview pagan authors using questions determined by a roll of the die. Enfys J. Book, welcome to WitchLit again.
It's great to be here, Victoria. Thanks for having me.
I am so excited to have you back on. I really enjoyed Sagittarius Witch, and I'm excited to talk to you about that. And so our first question for everybody, which you've already answered, so I'm going to mix it up a little bit, is, why write? So why write a book about astrology? Why co-author a book about astrology?
That's an excellent question that I asked myself quite a few times when I was offered the opportunity, because I have not historically been an astrologer at all. And I was sort of flummoxed when the main author, Ivo Dominguez Jr., approached me and said, "Hey, would you be interested in being the second author on this book?" And Ivo knows me. We're in the same tradition. He's one of the elders of the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel. And I'm like, Ivo, I'm not like an astrologer, right? Like, it's not my main axe. I'm a Kabbalist more than anything. And he said, yeah, but what we're asking you to write is about your lived experience as a Sagittarius witch. And it's much more like blog format. He's like, I am writing all of the crunchy astrology stuff. And I said, oh, good, because that is not a part I'd be comfortable with. But can I talk about myself? Can I write about myself? Yes, I can. And blogging is probably my preferred format and voice for writing. And it comes very easily and naturally to me. So I actually had a ton of fun with it. And I learned a lot along the way. I had a great sort of brainstorm session with Ivo at the beginning where he was like, okay, here's like some high points to hit in each of these sections you're being asked to write. Oh, and by the way, no pressure, but Ivo is also a Sagittarius. So, having to co-author the one that is like his sign was a little intimidating, but he seemed very pleased with what I created. I got really good feedback from him and from Elysia, the editor at Llewellyn. And ultimately, I'm really pleased to have been part of this whole amazing series of books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've gotten the opportunity to read a lot of them because I've had a lot of the co-authors on the show. And so one of the things I'm curious about, especially coming off having written the Queer Kabbalah book. So this has really got a lot more guardrails. Like you're kind of writing to formula in the series. So was that weird, or was that kind of nice to have that box?
I think the trickiest box of it was they were extremely strict on word count because they wanted all the books in the series to be exactly the same size and thickness. And ultimately, that was probably the trickiest part. Was at first they said it doesn't really matter if one section goes longer and one section shorter as long as you write this many thousand total of words overall. And then that turned out they changed their mind between when they told me that and when I turned in the manuscript, and they're like, you've got to make them all like pretty much exactly the word count for each section we gave you. So it was a challenge, but not one I was unfamiliar with, because when I was in college, I spent a semester in Australia, and at University of Queensland, they had extremely rigorous word count limits. Not only did they say maximum word count, that word count, you could only go 10% above or below. And if you did more than that, it was instant fail. So, and I was an English major, so we wrote a lot of papers. And a lot of them, you had to cram a lot of information into a very short word count. I was used to just kind of, oh, it's a 2-page assignment. Well, if I make it 5, it's fine. I couldn't do that anymore. So I had to get really careful with making each word count for 50. And I had a brief stint in journalism as well that helped that quality. But yeah, it was, I think the prescriptiveness actually fed the creativity more than anything, because it gave me a clear direction of where to go, and that made it easier in a way. I didn't have to come up with, okay, what am I going to say now, as much as like, oh, well, what's my experience with this? Okay, well, that's pretty easy. I can write about that.
Yeah. Oh, that makes sense. Especially the journalism part. Like, yeah, I mean, word count is everything.
Word count is the ruler of the journalism world.
Yeah. So, like, in addition to kind of that box, like, what do you feel like you learned, like, either about yourself or about your writing craft in the middle of this project?
Learned about myself that I have both the positive and negative stereotypes of a Sagittarius very much embedded within my personality. But one thing I thought was really interesting that I realized as I was writing is that you can use the strengths of being a Sagittarius to combat the weaknesses or the bad stereotypes. So like if you're struggling with, I'm trying to think of a good example from it. So like, no, I don't want to use that one. Hang on. If you're struggling with people who, for example, we have kind of a low tolerance for people lying or flaking out on us kind of thing.
Right.
People who are not true to their word. We really value integrity. Coming at it from a standpoint of the Sagittarian curiosity, as opposed to like just raw, kind of doing the barbarian rage thing, is one way to get around that, because you start to think about, well, why is this person not getting back to me? Why is this person not in, rather than just ruminating on it, ask them and say, hey, and coming at it from curiosity rather than angst, I think is really helpful. So there were a few examples of that, because I had to write a chapter on like how to deal with kind of the worst part of being a Sagittarius and all those bad things. And I'm like, oh, you really just flip it so that you're emphasizing the good parts to deal with the bad parts. And that was really interesting to me. And it brought to mind a whole lot of lessons that I've learned over the course of my life where I've done that unconsciously. And now I can do that more consciously.
Yeah, I like that. I liked you telling kind of a story around that idea about, people not responding and kind of wading into why rather than just being mad at them. And I think I can't remember if it's in the section immediately following that, but in one of Ivo's section, he's talking about, or you may have said this, I can't remember. Unfortunately, I've read a lot of books in January, so
it's okay. I understand.
My brain is a little melded, but that you, as whatever sign you are, like when you're at your worst, you're more like the sign before you, and when you're at your best, you're more like the sign in front of you. And I'm a Scorpio, so apparently I need to lean toward those Sag things. So, which is funny because I have a stellium in Libra, so it makes it hard. I'm a lot of Libra, but so
yeah, that was the thing that Ivo said that, and then I echoed it in the book in like a later part. So you were correct on both counts.
Oh, okay, well there you go. But yeah, I did not know that because I too am not an astrologer. But yeah, it was like really interesting little tidbit of information there. So
yeah. And with Sagittarians, it definitely makes sense because if we lean into the sign ahead of us, that's Capricorn, which is like take all your fiery energy, but give it structure, give it form, give it legs, a foundation so that you can actually finish the things you start. Versus if we lean back into Scorpio, we just become drama llamas, just like the gossip and the, political backbiting and stuff. It's not a good look on us or really anyone else. It's like the emotional side of Scorpio gets the best of us. But if we hang with the goats more and the sea goats, we're better people.
Yeah, it's always funny to me, and I am interviewing Zoe Howe about the Scorpio book in a couple weeks, and it's always funny to me. Like I feel like Scorpios get a lot of shit. Like we're kind of the whooping boy of the zodiac in a lot of ways.
My partner is a Scorpio, so yes.
Yeah, I found out pretty early in my life that I could not have a Scorpio partner. Like two of us together was not a good idea. Like all of my closest friends almost are Scorpios or Virgos, and my partner's a Virgo. So it seems a safer place to land for me. So
fair enough.
Yeah. It's funny. Like, I'm sure that kind of your experience too of writing this book, you don't think you're that into astrology, but then when you start reading about it, you're like, oh yeah. Here are the things that intersect.
Well, and what's neat is being a Kabbalist, there's a lot of overlap between astrological concepts and Kabbalistic concepts. And it's one of the reasons I got into Kabbalah in the first place is that it's kind of a key for other systems. So if you know Kabbalah, you can learn a lot about tarot and a lot about astrology very quickly. And likewise, if you know astrology or tarot, you can figure out Kabbalah pretty quickly because they have a lot of overlapping interconnections.
So I know in your tradition, Kabbalah plays a pretty strong role. Is that true for astrology as well, or?
Yes, I would say so. I would say that astrology is used for the structure of the tradition itself, as opposed to our rituals. The rituals are very heavily baked in Kabbalah, or Kabbalah is baked heavily into our ritual structures. But we're called the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel, and we use the Wheel of the Zodiac and the elements to determine like our covens. So we have a circle of Aquarius, we have a circle of Sagittarius that I believe we've just started. And apologies, Ivo, if I got those wrong. It's one of those things I don't have to rattle off very often. But basically, we're doing a circle for each zodiac sign with the ultimate goal of having, and then 12 covens within each circle, with the idea that we'll have 144 like covens eventually. And at this point, we have 14.
14. So that's more than the zodiac. So does that mean they repeat?
Right. So we have, the first circle has 12 covens in it, and the second circle now has 2. So each circle for each zodiac sign will ultimately have 12 covens each.
Oh, wow.
Okay. So yeah, we're 40 years old at this point. I believe this year will be maybe this year. Yeah, I think it's this year we turn 40 as a tradition. It started in 1984. So yeah, we've done a lot of work since then, and we have a lot of cool people.
Yeah, as I say, I think between interviewing you and Ivo, it's like I have started to meet more people involved with Sacred Wheel, and it's just been interesting to learn more about it. And the library project that Ivo's been really instrumental in, and so it's pretty interesting for those who are kind of into the, I guess, history and current. I don't know. I did a bonus episode last year, I think, with Phoenix LaFay about Margot Adler's Drawing Down the Moon.
Nice.
And I kind of wondered, like, who would be the person to do that now, like to take that landscape of witchcraft and paganism in the United States now. Like, I don't know that anybody has I don't know who's our current Margot Adler, I guess, to do that. But I think it's fascinating, and I would love to have seen if she had lived to do an update for the 2020s.
Yeah, That would have been fascinating. Phoenix LeFae is so great. As I was working on the book, the manuscript I just turned in at the end of 2023, her new book on creating rituals that actually work was really instrumental as
Mhm.
part of, my research and checking my own instincts
Mhm.
against what other people have said. And it's such a useful book. It's really, really good.
Yeah, her work is so approachable too. Like she has an authoritative voice, but it's always in like, we'll try this kind of way,
Right.
which I really
Mhm.
appreciate.
Oh yeah. And just a super kind and generous person. She's one of the people I interviewed as well as I was working on the book.
Hmm. Oh, wonderful. Yeah. No, that'll be exciting. I since we've broached that topic, I guess, you've got other stuff in the pipeline. Do you want to talk about kind of upcoming projects and where you're taking your writing?
Absolutely. So the manuscript I just turned in doesn't have a title yet, but what it is a book of rituals for queer rites of passage. So the idea is that if you are a queer person and you are going through one of the many rites of passage associated with being queer, whether you are trans and taking your first dose of hormones, or if you are coming out to your family as gay or lesbian or asexual or bisexual or any of those, um, having a magical ritual you can do in association with those big moments can help give them sort of a focal point and a container and added coping mechanisms for dealing with some of the
Hmm.
stress around that. So there's quite a diversity of rituals in there, a few of them written by guest authors as well. And I'm really excited to share it with the world. It'll be released, I believe, in the back half of 2025. So it's a little ways off, but I'm really
Hmm.
excited about it.
That is exciting. And I don't know, I'm curious. I noticed just because I've read a lot of Llewellyn books because I've had a lot of Llewellyn authors on the show that there does seem to be this trend in their books to have guest authors kind of
Mhm.
cameo in other books. Um, can you say anything about that, or like, do you
Sure.
have some thoughts on maybe why or how that's working? Or
Well, I can't speak to it broadly, but for this particular book, I felt it was important to incorporate a diverse set of viewpoints
Mhm.
and queer experiences because, yes, I am queer, but I am also specifically non binary, bisexual, and white. And I wanted to have people who were not that exact thing and who had
Mhm.
gone through different things than me. And that also included the people I interviewed who maybe didn't contribute. I wanted to interview people who had a lot of different perspectives and experiences. So, one of the important things is that I have never conducted a hand fasting ever. And I wanted to have a hand fasting ritual in there. And I knew that Storm Fairy had created a polyamorous hand fasting ritual for a previous book
Mhm.
for The Satyr's Kiss. And so I asked if he'd be willing to update, like sort of adapt that for the book so that we could have a hand fasting ritual that I know would work
Mhm.
and would be useful for people who are joining two or more people together in that kind of bond. I also had a wonderful ritual written by Reverend Ron Padron, who is a Cuban American uh, kind of hedge witch priest who wrote this really fantastic ritual for celebrating and honoring chosen family.
Oh, nice.
And it's really beautiful. And having him speak from his own experience and cultural background was really
Mhm.
interesting. And I think those I ended up being four different rituals that were written by contributors, and they add so much to the book and such a wonderful flavor and diversity of viewpoints.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I love the idea of it, and like I said, having read a lot of Llewellyn books, like I do think it brings a lot to the topic because you do get another perspective, and you do get just a shift kind of from what the main author of the book is talking about. I think just from a publisher standpoint, I'm like, oh, how do you navigate that? With like payment and royalties and like how do you decide, how to navigate all that? So I think that part of it to me sounds complex, but the end product of it I think is amazing.
Well, and I think the person who deserves an award for pulling off the most complex contributor model is Ivo Dominguez Jr. for the Sun Sign series, because they not only each had a secondary author who wrote 14,000 words, they also had 6 or 7 individual contributors who wrote short pieces as well. Mm-hmm. And tracking all of those contributions for 12 books in flight, I just have nothing but respect. That, as a project manager, that makes my head explode.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I was reading this one because, I mean, like I said, I've read several, and I think like Dawn Aurora Hunt wrote a recipe for every book, so they appear in every book. And then Sandra Kynes' correspondences are in every book. Mm-hmm. From I think taken from her really lovely big book of correspondences, like the complete book of correspondences book. And so yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on. And I do love that. And I think it's one of the things that's interesting about the series, because I think, there is this, and I guess from a reader or customer point of view, it's like, oh, a series is just a way to get people to buy more books, right? Which in and of itself is not a bad thing. Like, let's be honest, that's not a bad thing. But that sometimes they seem pat because it's a series. Like, it's just like, mm-hmm. Oh, here, let's just do this thing. But I feel like that's really not been my experience in reading these. Like, they really are, yes, they're a fun gloss on a topic that you could go as deep as you wanted to go on and get as seriously into as you wanted to. But they're also just, I love the perspective of so many different practitioners talking about really their own practice. I mean, the co-author as well as the other contributors. Like, I think that to me is just kind of fascinating to get that many takes on a topic.
Right. Well, like, no one person can speak for what it's like to be a Sagittarius witch for all Sagittarian witches. Like, mm-hmm. We all have very different experiences in life and very different strengths and weaknesses. But we do have what's in common is that we are all Sagittarius witches. So it's really cool to see other authors and how they approach the subject. And yeah, that is one of the things I really appreciate about these books, is trying to incorporate a diversity of viewpoints.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have not started Ivo and Zoe's book, so I'm looking forward to diving into that to get some insight on Scorpios. But I will say, for listeners who might have not picked one of these up yet, is each book also talks about those signs as rising signs and mm-hmm. moon signs. So though it is the sun sign series, you also get some of that more in-depth astrology, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I love how Ivo does sections on, like, okay, how does your moon sign come into play based on what it is? How does your rising sign impact things? Because, yeah, everybody is different. And though I am a Sagittarius, in a lot of ways, I am very much not a stereotypical Sagittarius because I have a lot of Earth in my chart. Mm-hmm. So I am one of those people. I lean into Capricorn very easily because I tend to finish what I start. I tend to be very organized. I tend to be the one herding the cats rather than the cat that needs to be herded. So, which is one of the reasons I think they asked me to do this, because they knew I could meet a deadline.
Yeah.
So, but yes, it's really interesting to see all the different types of Sagittarius you can be.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it's interesting to me, like, how that plays into like your day job of being a project manager. Because one of my closest friends is also a project manager, and I see that a lot of those same things in her, like that, the sense of order and timelines and deadlines and all of that. And I think that part is really interesting. How do you think that impacts you as a writer?
Oh, it definitely benefits me as a writer, because when I look at a big thing, I can see the details. And when I see the details, I can also get a sense of the larger picture and keep those two different perspectives in mind at the same time, which I think is a tricky balancing act. But if, you have those gifts of organization, it comes a little more easily and naturally.
Yeah. I know. I just kind of imagine it's a Gantt chart, right? It's a Gantt chart.
Yeah.
It's like a Gantt chart of writing a novel. And then my brain hurts because I'm also not a planner in that regard. I don't plot. So I'm like, oh, but would it be useful? It would be so useful to have that.
So what I do instead is I don't do a Gantt chart, but I do a Trello board, which is like a Kanban board for those project manager geeks among us, like myself. And basically, I set a goal every week of this is what I'm going to accomplish this week with the book. And I can change it depending on how busy I am that week. Because some weeks it's like, if I get 1,000 words written, I'm going to be lucky. And
Mhm.
some weeks is like, I have a little more time. I can probably knock out this chapter and edit this other one. So basically, I'm like, this is what I'm going to do this week. And then once it's done, I move them over to the done column. And then I pull a different one from the backlog and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do now, and just constantly chipping away at it rather than being overwhelmed by the enormity of the project. Just see the next goal in front of you right now and focus on that and get
Mhm.
that done, and then worry about the next thing. It's
Yeah.
like how to eat an elephant one bite at a time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that's the thing. I think when folks who don't write books, who are not writers, look into people who write books, they're like, how do you write a whole book? And I was like, literally a word at a time. Like that's
Yep.
literally how you do it. And but it can be daunting when you sit down at that, blank page, blank screen, however you write, and go, okay, now I've got to find 80,000 words, 120,000 words, whatever it is. It can be hard.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, and I'm lucky I majored in English with a writing emphasis in college, so I got a lot of that training, and as I said before, I have some experience in journalism, and most of my career has been in communications, so I've kind
Mhm.
of slowly honed my voice and my craft, although in different contexts.
Mhm.
But the thing that I really hold in my mind is kind of user friendliness. Am I writing something that's easily understood by people of a wide variety of backgrounds and experience and knowledge? Am I assuming they know things that they don't?
Mhm.
Always having that eye in mind.
Yeah. I think especially for nonfiction, that's like super important to really think
Yeah.
about your audience and, where they are. And, I think it's easy to either baby them, like assume that they don't know anything, or, like it's almost as easy to do that as it is to assume they know more than they do. I think you really kind of have to find the sweet spot.
Exactly. And that was one of the tricks with writing the Queer Rites of Passage book is that I cannot assume the background or magical experience level of anybody and I want who reads this book, and I want to make sure it's useful to everybody
Mhm.
who wants to use it. So what I ended up coming up with was kind of a plug and play framework of like, throw your own tradition and practices in here. Please feel free to take stuff out, put stuff in,
Mhm.
rearrange it. Do whatever makes sense to you. You have my full permission to completely change all of these rituals and make it work for you. I do spend some time at the beginning talking about like what each component does. So it's like,
Mhm.
if you're going to get rid of it, do something else that does the same thing. But, I want this book to be useful for people who've been practicing Gardnerian Wiccans for 20 years, and for the person who this is their first witchcraft book ever, and they're, 17 and
Right.
they want to do something, and everything in between. So there's a lot of like, hey, insert the deity you want to work with here. Here are some suggestions, but please feel free to do something that is not in the list.
Yeah.
Whatever pantheon you work with, or if you don't work with a pantheon, just throw that section out, not assuming anyone's particular
Mhm.
practice. And that was a challenge, but also kind of a fun one. And I'm really excited when the book comes out to hear about the kinds of rituals people came up with and how they spiced up what I had created and made it uniquely their own.
Yeah, no, I'm excited now too. I really enjoyed Phoenix's book for that same reason. So I am uh ready for the end of 2025. Maybe that means we can
Yay!
skip the end of 2024 because I think it's gonna be rough. That
Yeah.
is another podcast.
That's a podcast where we just both drink a bottle of whiskey and kind of cry.
Yeah, yeah, let's not go there.
Yeah.
But since we are in 2024 and you just turned in this manuscript round one, um, like what does writing right now look for? Are you taking a break? Like what's your plan for the rest of I guess not for the rest of your writing life, but for the next few months, I guess maybe.
So for 2024, my plan is to not write another book because I wrote 2 last year and that was a lot. And as we were talking before the podcast, I didn't have a lot of time for like fun or friends last year. And I ended the year feeling pretty burned out and spent a really long time playing Baldur's Gate 3, which I have no regrets about whatsoever. Karlak is Bay. But, this year, I want to make time for fun and joy and rest. So I will definitely have a fair bit of editing to do on the book I just turned in. I've got marketing to do for Sagittarius Witch. And I'm also going to be taking a sabbatical at work in the summer and spending a couple of months in the UK and Southern Ireland. And I'll probably do some book appearances there, and I'm speaking in person at the Goddess Conference in Glastonbury, so that's really exciting. I've spoken there virtually before. So other than that, I am basically just in that regenerative phase of figuring out what will be the next book and not putting pressure on myself to come up with it or start it right now, but just kind of let myself cook and figure out what would be a good next book to work on and really make sure that it's something I want to do.
Mm-hmm. So since I've had you on the show before, and when we talked the first time, we were really on the eve of your first book coming out.
Yes.
So how do you feel? Like, is it different now that you've had another book come out, like that postpartum book period, or like, how does that feel different, or is it the same, or what do you feel like has changed?
Well, as we're recording this, the second book hasn't come out yet, so I don't fully know because Sagittarius Witch comes out in April of 2024. So depending on when this podcast comes out,
it'll be out when folks get this, because we're in a bit of a backlog because COVID.
That's all right. Yeah, that happens. But there's definitely a boost of confidence that happens after you've published your first book. And like, I can do this. I've done the whole process start to finish. But I'm trying to remember which author it was. I think it was Chuck Wendig who talked about you're learning how to write the book you're writing. And once you've written it, you have to learn to write the next one. And each book has a different experience, right? Of writing it is completely different from writing the other books you've done. So I found that to be true. Partly because Sagittarius Witch had a very prescribed format and content that I did not have to come up with, which was great and freeing in a lot of ways. I could just focus on the writing rather than the structure. But so it was a very different experience to write that. And it was also writing outside of the content that I typically wrote. But writing Queer Rites of Passage was also completely different because I'm writing a ton of rituals, which is very different from the first book and the second book. So, yeah. Oh, and I forgot to mention other things ahead for me with writing. Not specifically writing, but I've been recording new episodes of For Quick Cues, my podcast that you mentioned. And I'm hoping beyond hope to have some motivation and time to write more blog posts on Major Arqueerna, which the blog has been languishing a little bit in the last 6 months. So I'm hoping to get that back up and running and do more kind of casual short form writing again.
Understandably, given the long form writing you've been doing. So that makes sense. It's hard to interweave those. Yeah, I think I love that idea of you're learning to write the book you're currently writing. Because people have asked, because I just published my 6th book in November.
Congrats.
Yeah. It's shocking to think about every time I think about it. But I'm in the middle of writing 2 books right now because I'm clearly not thinking straight. And one's fiction and one's nonfiction, which is actually good because it's easier to swap back and forth. But the thing I always realize now, working on books 7 and 8, is that I always get to a point where like, I have no idea what I'm doing. Why do I think I know how to write a book? Like, it just hits me every time. And it's about 10,000 words in. And I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. What am I doing? I don't know how to write. I don't know how to spell. It's just like,
what are words?
It goes out the window. And then I kind of have to let it sit for a couple weeks and come back to it. And I don't know why that's part of my process, but I've just learned, though, it will frustrate me in the moment and make me question myself, that I will get through that.
Yeah, there's kind of like a sine wave that happens in the course of writing a book where you go through periods of like, this is awesome, I love this, and down into what in the customer onboarding world we call the trough of disillusionment, where you are like, this is shit. Why
The worst
did I
decision I've ever
decide to do
made.
this?
Yeah.
Why did I think I could write on this topic? What do I even know about this? Why this is so hard and this sucks and I cannot turn this in. And then gradually you get back up into the, okay, this might be, usually by the time you finish the book, you're kind of in between the high and the low. You're like, this is sufficient. This is okay.
Yeah. You've usually
like,
read it so much that you're like, it's fine. Not realizing that you've read it 100,000 times, so nothing is new or surprising about it anymore.
Yeah,
it will be for
exactly.
a reader. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that sine wave is a great description, because I've seen like the little memes of authors or artists, like, this is great, I'm great, blah, blah, blah. And then it goes, this is shit, I'm shit, artist shit, and then you kind of go back up the thing again. And it's like, yeah, it's not even imposter syndrome. Like, it is different than imposter syndrome. It really is like almost like a crisis of faith in your ability to do your art or your creativity that you've chosen. Like, and I think it's just part of the process. Like, I really, like, most of the people I know who are creative in some way have this experience of just going, why, and I think that's why a lot of projects get abandoned, because you may not have figured out that there is another side to that. Like, I think part of learning to finish a novel or finish a work is learning that sine wave, like riding that roller coaster and figuring out, and that you do eventually come down the hill. Like, it's okay.
To quote Jake from Adventure Time, dude, sucking at something is the first step toward being kind of good at something.
Exactly.
And I always try to take to heart that experience, or the saying, like, write it badly, but write it. You can't edit a blank page. You can't make a blank page better. You have to have words on the page. And so when I kind of go through two phases with my writing, one is like, okay, I'm writing 1,500 words this week. That's my thing. And that's my rule, is like, they don't have to be good words. They just have to be words that are vaguely related to the subject matter. I can always go back and change them. But I have to get something on the page, and having that kind of concrete goal is what motivates me, because it's easy to get stuck in that, like, well, how do I say this? Oh, how do I say this right? I will literally write something, and then I'll put, like, I use Google Docs, and I'll put a comment on it saying, this sucks, fix it. It's like, I know when I'm writing it, this is terrible. And then later when I go back, I'm like, it doesn't completely suck. Like, there's some stuff I can keep here. I just need to reframe it a little bit, and then it's fine. But that's the quickest way to silence my inner critic, is just like, I'm going to write it bad. Like, I'm going to write a terrible first draft. You commit to the bad first draft, and then you make it better. Yeah. And it's cliche and everyone says it, but it's true.
But it's true. I mean, my first, the first developmental editor I worked with, that was her take too, is like, the first draft is you making the clay. Like, unlike a sculptor, like, you've got to make your own clay. And then you start, finding the book in that mass of words. But the other thing I think is interesting is just like, like, it's just pulling teeth sometimes, like, and I think that's the thing, is like, as a writer, I do a lot of bargaining with myself. And I don't know if this is true for you too. Like, my goal for 2024 was to write 500 words a day, which doesn't sound like a lot, because a lot of people are like, 1,000 words a day or whatever. And I was like, well, I have a podcast that comes out every week. I'm writing 2 books, not just one. And, I have a family, and, other things are going on. I have a day job, still a part-time day job, but I still have a part-time day job. And I was like, 500 words is really a way to get my butt in the seat. And sometimes I'll write a lot more than that. But I've said to myself, I'll write 500 words every day. And sometimes that's really easy to hit. And sometimes 500 is hard to hit. And, this, like I said, this is coming out probably in June, and we're, the beginning of February, and I'm still getting over COVID, and I haven't written much since I've had COVID, and I had to give myself off the hook because I can't think straight. Like, it was just hard to focus. And I was like, do I really want to write 500 words and throw them away, or do I want to focus on something else? So I've just kind of been doing, what is the term? Productive procrastination, I guess. So I've been reading, I've been doing research for both books, and just kind of recharging the well while I get better. And it took me a couple days to not beat myself up about missing my 500 words for those days. But now it's okay.
One of my other tricks is that I work with a friend who's writing at the same time, and we create joint spell work around the books we're writing, that each of us like has a version of the spell work at our home. And for me, it's candles, and for her, it's plants. And both of those things sort of require tending. So it's like, if I'm going into a writing jag and I'm really not feeling it, I will light my candle that's part of the spell and just be like, okay, I need to put some energy into this. I'm going to make this offering, and then I'm going to go. And it usually helps me write. Doing that spell work was part of my weekly goals. Like early on, it was just like, okay, I'm going to make the spell this week. That's what I'm going to do. It's not writing, but it's facilitating the writing later. And that's just as valid.
Yeah. Well, and I do think a lot of writing, and I wish I could remember who said this, a lot of writing is sometimes just staring into space. And, and I feel like that, especially for me, like one of the things I found interesting going back and forth between writing a novel and writing a nonfiction piece is that I don't think I realized how differently my brain worked between those two pieces. And you may have found this, like the difference between like writing a song or writing a blog or writing a book. I mean, you may have had the same experience, but it's just been really interesting, like how much more the thing that I don't have to open 7 books and have all the tabs open, that thing, the novel, takes so much more of my brain than writing the nonfiction piece. And it surprised me. I really expected it to be the other way, and it really isn't.
Fascinating. As a side note, I'm super excited for your new stuff coming out. Like, I'm very curious to hear about the nonfiction book, but we were talking before the show, and I read the Voices of the Dead series and just absolutely loved it. And it's one of very, very few books in my life where I loved it so much, I immediately bought it as a gift for other people. And I think I've bought 3 or 4 copies of it of the omnibus at this point, because I'm like, A, I want to support you, but B, it's just a darn good series. I had a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. So thank you for interviewing me and introducing me to it, because it's a lot of fun to read.
Yeah, it's always nice to hear it, because, I mean, as you know, like sometimes writing and publishing books, it feels like shouting into the void. So it's always nice to get feedback. And, it's funny because now looking at like Who by Water, the first book in the series, and most listeners know I don't talk about my books on the show by title or very much, but like looking at it now, like I'm like, oh, it could be so much better. And I'm like, you know what? That just shows that I've grown since I wrote that, and I need to just let it go.
There was this beautiful story about Terry Pratchett doing a signing in like the early 2000s, and someone brought Color of Magic for him to sign. And he kind of looked askance at it, said, I was very young when I wrote this. And it was like, I've done a lot better work since then. And the person who brought it said, yeah, but I really like to see how writers grow over the course of their career. And Terry said, well, that's all right then. And then he signed it. And I thought that was just such a sweet story.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we've hit the almost bingo, because we've narrowly tangentially touched on Neil Gaiman by talking about Terry Pratchett.
I love Neil Gaiman. He is the best person on Tumblr.
Everywhere he is, he's great. But there's a story that involves Terry Pratchett that I always think about, like, because my first book signing, nobody showed up. And so the first book signing Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman did in New York for Good Omens, nobody showed up.
Nobody showed up. Yeah.
And I was like, this is Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman, like 2 of the, pinnacle of the sci-fi fantasy genres. And I was like, well, that's okay then. Yeah, sometimes that happens. But it's just good to remember that, like, yes, writing, I guess, has this strata of like how many books you sell or how many people know your name or did you hit the New York Times or whatever. But at the end of the day, we all kind of have to do the process the same. Like getting to the book in your hand, that process is largely the same for everybody, whether they sell 10 books or 10,000.
Yeah. Being part of a band taught me a great deal of that humility in the last 10 years. Being with the Misbehaving Maidens, where we literally performed for ballrooms of 300 people at Dragon Con, and they had to keep giving us bigger rooms because we kept filling the room and people weren't able to get in. So like that's the top.
Mm-hmm.
But then we performed at a convention that hired us and we were the main stage band and there were 3 people in the audience. It's like, so those are the extremes. Like we've performed for 3 people and we've performed for 300 people. And, band-wise, 300 isn't like the biggest in the world, but for a little band from Maryland that sings nerdy, dirty songs and we're very niche, and also adults-only entertainment because we swear a lot and sing about sex, that's pretty impressive, I think. Especially when that 300-person one is like a 12-hour drive from home, where we never performed in Atlanta except at Dragon Con. So people didn't necessarily know us from our local shows, but they showed up.
Yeah. Well, and I think especially when you think about Dragon Con, when there's so many things taking people's attention now, like it's so huge that, that makes sense to me that, having 300 people, that's cool.
It's an 80,000 person convention. So 300 feels like a drop in the bucket. But at any given time, gosh, there's so many really big celebrities doing stuff and so many concerts. And like, there's a million things you can do at any given time, not to mention the vendor hall is 4 stories of a convention center. So if you're like me and you mainly like to shop at these conventions, you can entertain yourself for hours in that vendor hall. But, it was super cool. Like Dragon Con is a deeply overwhelming experience to be at, but those shows were pretty awesome.
Yeah.
But yeah, you learn that humility though. It's like just because we perform for 3 people this week doesn't mean we suddenly suck.
Right.
It just means people didn't show up and that's okay. And just because we perform for 300 doesn't automatically mean we're awesome either. It's you're somewhere in the middle, right? Like you're great. You're good.
Yeah.
You kind of have to take the average of your various experiences and calibrate to that.
Yeah. I was recently introduced to the term sublebrity, which I really like, which also could have some connotations depending on your sexual proclivities. But Catechus, who's a pagan witchy romance writer who people will have heard their episode before this one airs, talked about it as like, to be, to not really court fame, but to court a following in like your
niche
amongst your people.
Yes.
And I was like, I really like that idea a lot because I always felt like the very famous don't belong to themselves anymore. And that's always kind of unnerved me. And so I think I like that idea of being a sublebrity.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I do not aim for massive fame. I really don't. Like, I love that my books have had impact on people. I like that, I can go a place like Pagonicon and there are people who are like, oh, I read your book. Like, that's super cool.
Yeah.
Love that. I never want to get to the level where there's constantly fake Instagram accounts being made of me, like where I'm constantly having to weed through hate mail and death threats and like that level of thing. I just no, thank you.
Yeah.
I or like people just kind of stalking you at every event and all that. Like, no, I want to stay a person.
Yeah.
I'm just a person.
Well, and I always wonder too, like, and my loftiest goal for the podcast is to get Neil Gaiman on. And maybe if we invoke his name often enough, he would say yes. But I haven't even had the testicular gonad, whatever, fortitude to ask yet. So who knows? But like, I really am curious, like once you are at that level where people know you, know your face as a writer, and there's so few writers like that, like at that level,
Mm-hmm.
Like, how does that change how you approach your work? Like, does it mess with your head? Like, who's your audience? Like, all of that stuff. Like, I just wonder what that's like to be at that level. Or is it still just you and the page at the end of the day? Like, do you have to like build a wall to keep that out? So I'm just curious.
Yeah. Do you have to play for a very specific fan base? Do you get locked into what has sold really, really well
Mm-hmm.
and having to just keep doing that forever? Or do you get the opportunity to take risks because you've proven you're bankable? Do you have more
Mm-hmm.
latitude for that?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know the
Yeah.
answer to that.
Well, and I think it's interesting because, like, you know, especially with independent publishing and self-publishing, like, you kind of can take more risks. Like, that opportunity is there for people lower on the strata, I guess, however you want to think about it. But you know, you might not make any money at it, but the opportunity is there if you want it to take risks and, you know, to write between the genres and all the things that people do. So who knows? I don't know. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating thing to think about, but not anything that's an immediate problem for me. So.
Or me. Like, no, I like people like one of my friends, when I saw them at Ren Fair for the first time in a few years, I saw them. I was like, well, how have you been? They're like, well, not as good as you, best-selling author. And I just laughed so hard. I'm like, I am nowhere near a bestseller. Trust me.
Yeah.
Like what I write is very, very niche. It is not going to be on the New York Times list. And I'm totally okay with that.
Yeah, really. It's like what? And I think, you know, I don't know that there's like a yes, this will definitely be New York Times, but I think you've got to sell like about 5,000 books in a week to even hit the bottom of the list. So,
yeah,
most of us are not going to have that experience. But I always think about, and I've talked about this on the show, and people probably know the statistic, like when all of the merger stuff was going on with some of the big five or big four, or however many of them there are now, left houses, they were talking about, you know, when they had to disclose their sales stuff. And like fully 50% of their authors sold less than 12 books.
Wow.
Like 50% of the books published in a year with a major publisher sold 12 books.
And you think about the hurdles they had to go through to get that deal.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like how many rejections they got to be finally picked up by a major publisher. And then, yeah. Oof.
Yeah, it's kind of shocking. So I'm like, if nothing else, I know I have sold more than 12 books.
Yep.
So there we go.
There we go. What was a fascinating experience? I got to go to the American Library Association conference a couple years ago as part of, like, shortly after Queer Kabbalah came out. And I was not emotionally prepared for it. They just hand your book out for free to like a bunch of people. This is how they market to libraries, is they like give your book away so that the librarians read it and they want to stock it, which is great. But I didn't know that's what was happening. And so I'm signing books that people have just been handed, like just here, have a book, get it signed, have a book, get it signed. And it was kind of dumbfounding, but also really cool because I got a lot of really wonderful stories. Like they publish a schedule ahead of time. Like these are the books that are getting signed that you can get for free. And, you know, I felt pretty good that all mine disappeared within, I think, an hour, 20 minutes or something. They got rid of like 75 books. But then the tarot book that was after me, they were gone in like 12 minutes. I was like, well, okay, that's humbling.
Yeah.
But I got to hear all these wonderful stories. People came up to me like, you know, my kid just came out as trans and they're in high school and they're really interested in spirituality, but they feel like shut out from all of it because they're trans. And I'm really excited about this book, might give them something to kind of cling to. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so sweet. I hope that and I wrote like a really inspirational message in the book when I signed it for their kid. And that's just, those kind of things absolutely make my day. But yeah, selling 12 books, it's like, you know, if you had to deduct the books that were given away for free, like, does that mean no? But yeah, there's some really interesting feels around that. But it was such a cool day. And I'm such a library nerd that I got to wander the show floor and I could also pick up free books. I didn't get, like, I missed out on all the like big name ones, but I did get a really cute, like, board kids book for my friend's kid. So it was really cute little book about mermaids. And I got it signed, sent it off to them. And they had a whole zines area, which was really neat because I love zines.
Oh, that's cool. It's nice to know the American Library Association is honoring zines. That's good to hear.
Yes. Yeah, I think a lot of libraries are getting into that and like having zine making classes and things like that. Like it's a way they can draw in more young people to the library. Yeah, I actually turned a couple of my blog posts into zines and have them kind of open sourced on majorarqueerna.com so people can download them and print and fold them themselves and distribute because they're kind of general about being trans or being non-binary. And here are some things, like one of them is what to do when you mess up someone's pronouns.
Yes.
Which, like, I can hold someone's attention span for the duration of a mini zine on this and tell them some do's and don'ts. And it was just a blog post. And I'm like, this translates really well into this little zine format. And the other one is like, here's a metaphor for understanding why someone would change their gender when they're in their like middle age as opposed to teenagers. And here's a metaphor you can use to kind of wrap your head around what they're going through. And I call it the itchy sweater metaphor. But it's been really cool because when I go to speaking and signing events, I bring a bunch of these zines as just like giveaways, and people pick them up and they're like, oh, I'm going to share this with my mom, or I'm going to share this with my friend who's really having trouble with this. And yeah, that's been really cool.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah. And I will just plug for listeners who happen to be zine authors. You don't have to write novels or giant books to come on the show. If you're writing zines and you're publishing zines, give me a call or text me or something. Don't call me because you better not have my number.
And who likes phone calls anyway? Phone calls are terrible. Just text.
It's like I am definitely an Xer, but there are times when I will prefer a phone call when texting is like, I can't write a novel about this. But honestly, like just to ping me, like send me a text message. So.
Yeah. I have a couple people who I will do like a full length phone call with because it is the best way to communicate with them. And yeah, I'm a Zennial. I'm right between. I was born in 79. So I'm like right between Gen X and Millennial. Yeah. We had our first computer in the home in 83. So I have a lot of the millennial, like early adopter technology stuff, but also I played outside like a lot by myself, or with kids unsupervised. So, I kind of have both ends of that spectrum. But yeah, like I do like having a good long talk on the phone, but like who has time anymore? There's a couple people where I schedule it like, we're going to have a call and it's going to be great and we'll just catch up. But for the most part, it's like, just text me, or we send memes back and forth. And that's how we show love.
Love through memes. Yes. That is definitely part of the 2020s.
Yes.
Love through memes. When the world is on fire and memes are easier. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. No, I get that. Oh, Enfys, this is so much fun. We're definitely going to have to do it out again when the next book comes out. But before that, you want to tell people where they can find you, and then we'll do our game of chance.
Excellent. Yeah, I was waiting for the dice. Yes. Everything I do, you can find at majorarqueerna.com, including links to Major Arqueerna on Instagram and Major Arqueerna on, it's on Instagram and Facebook at this point because I got rid of X, Twitter, whatever. I'm an ex-Twitterer. Yeah. But also, if you want to follow my personal stuff, I'm usually just Enfys Book I'm just Enfys Book on Instagram, and trying to think. Oh, I'm on Mastodon as well. Enfys Book at kind.social.
Cool. Awesome. All right. And those will be in the show notes. So people can click on that easily.
And I'm not sharing my Tumblr with you, but
yeah, I have a Tumblr mostly so I can read Tumblr, but I haven't posted on it in literal years. So, but the resurgence of Tumblr has been nice to see because I like the long form.
It's my happy social network. It's one of the few that's not touched by an algorithm, so you can actually have the reverse chronological view, and that's just the only way to view it. And it's just, I don't know. I know a handful of the people that I follow in real life. And mostly it's just give me Baldur's Gate 3 memes. Just give me like Our Flag Means Death and Good Omens content. And it's like my happy social network at the end of the day. I curate a very happy feed there. And I just love it.
It's good to have a little bit of escapism, I think, in your social media because it can get a little overwhelming. Cool. So you know how this works because you've done this before and you kind of do this on your own podcast. So I will roll our lowly 6-sided die. And depending on what number I roll, you'll get a question about death, sex, religion, politics, or money. And if I roll a 6, you get to pick which one you want.
Okay.
1, death.
Perfect.
We did talk about that some, but we'll talk about it some more. So I had this as one of the questions for you when you were on last time, and you didn't get one. I think you got politics, maybe?
Yeah, I think so.
So, and this is like one of those questions I've had floating around for a while, but when you shuffle off this mortal coil and join the ancestors, what do you want to happen to like your notes and books and your unfinished work? What would be ideal for you as a writer?
So one thing I have written into my end of life documents is that any money that continues to be made from my works should go to the assembly of the sacred wheel. I figured they trained me up, they deserve that. So that piece on a very practical level. Also just a pitch for everyone, get your end of life documents in order. I don't care how young you are, and especially if you're single and you don't want your parents deciding things for you, please, please, please get those things created. And also just write up a document where people can find your important documents in case you die. But that's a whole other rant. So what do I want to happen to? I would love it if my stuff would stay in print as long as possible. I'm hoping that my band's music stays online in perpetuity as long as we have an online for it to be. And my notes.
Like your papers.
I don't know.
Like your papers.
Yeah, my papers. I mean, honestly, burn them. I don't think I'm not too precious about my process. There's a lot of scattered bullshit in my Google Docs and Google Keep that doesn't need to see the light of day. Like there are love poems to people who should never see them, that kind of thing. Yeah. So just let all that stuff go. That would be fine by me. I did actually do kind of a cool thing though once where I've written, I'm a lyricist and I've written music and songs that my band performed, but I also wrote a lot of poems and songs that never saw the light of day. So I created like a chapbook, but I only printed like 3 copies. And like these are just my works and I just wanted to see them in printed format and never, ever release them to the world. So I have that. And, that printed copy that I have can go to somebody who cares quite a bit about me and will never, ever release it. Because it is not good poetry. It's just like, this is something I found amusing. It makes me happy, but it is not for the world.
Yeah.
Sorry, folks.
It's always interesting because I've talked to like researchers who've, really gotten into like a particular author or artist or something and like having like a receipt from the hardware store can be interesting to that person who's researching that person's life, so it's interesting to me. Like, I don't know that I'm a writer that somebody's going to dedicate their academic career to. Let's put it that way.
I mean, same.
But I am curious, like, what value do we have in this thing? And I do think, because you specifically mentioned you have a lot of stuff in Google Docs and Google Keep, like what happens to the like actual like digital ephemera versus like the physical ephemera?
Yeah, I'm meticulous about backing up my Google Docs to like a USB drive so that I don't just have it in the cloud. Because, there's no such thing as the cloud. It's just somebody else's computer, people.
Right.
That's
the
another
cloud
rant.
does not really exist. The cloud is on the ground.
Right. The cloud is on the ground.
Recently, the cloud is on the ground. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if the most interesting things I leave behind are hardware store receipts, I've done something very wrong. I think if someone really wants to study my life, there are a lot of stories out there from people who have known me that would be far more interesting. I think I'm a little more concerned about what happens to like my magical paraphernalia than like my written stuff, like my tools and, that kind of thing. I have that also in my end of life documents, what to do with that stuff. And of course, most important of all is my cats. If my partner and I go at the same time, making sure they are cared for is a much more pressing thing than what happens to my notes.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you make. Like, and I don't know if magical practitioners who especially have not done end of life documents, like what happens to your stuff is kind of important. You really want to think about that, like who's going to get those things? What happens to them? Are there things you want destroyed? You know, because you've imprinted on these in a way. I mean, if you are also a practitioner, you've imprinted on these things are special in a way that your sheets aren't. So like,
right.
How do you, and like, me, like, I always wonder, like, I heavily annotate my books. So like somebody may not want those just to read them because it can be really distracting. But could that be interesting to somebody? I don't know. Like, it's just weird, like your library and your tools and the things you've made, those things are.
I had a dear friend pass away very suddenly. She was in her late 40s and just up and died of a heart attack one day, just here and gone. And I ended up with she was both a coven mate of mine and the live-in partner of one of my best friends. And I was very fortunate that I was offered a couple of her magical things. And she had this beautiful, ornate, wooden, kind of carved plate that she had intended to turn into her pentacle. She was going to wood burn a pentacle on like the back of it and keep like the beautiful, it's just very intricately carved wooden plate. And I was allowed to receive that. I was given that. And then I did what she had planned to do, which was would burn a pentacle on the back. And it is my pentacle now. And having that connection to her is amazing. And it's one of my most cherished magical tools. And I would hope that, when I go, people will take, some of my tools and give them new life, particularly if they were close to me. I don't want them to end up at Goodwill. That's the main thing. But for those who do have a ton of books and things, the New Alexandrian Library, one of their fundraisers is they do a store and they take other people's used magical ephemera that's donated and they will sell it and use the money that they sell it for to fund the New Alexandrian Library. So that's another, I'm like, for all my stuff that I don't care about, like my crystal collection and, my books and whatever, they can all go to the NAL, the New Alexandrian Library Fund. But like my tools, I would want to go to people who would particularly cherish. Yeah,
no, that makes sense to me. And I was just thinking, like, you also don't want like some random person at Goodwill buying that. Like, I mean, that just seems weird to me. Like they're getting more than they bargained for potentially.
Right. Yeah.
This is how you end up with a cursed plate, people.
Yes. Or just something very haunted.
Yes.
So our lesson from this whole podcast is get your end of life documents in order for the love of God.
There you go. I mean, your PSA for today.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, Enfys, thank you so much. This has been lovely and wonderful. It's always wonderful to talk to you. And like I said, we're just planning now to do this again in 2025.
Woohoo! I look forward to telling you all about whatever the book will have a title by the time this comes out to the world. This episode comes out, but so I guess just go to majorarqueerna.com. And if there's anything I can share, I'll be putting it there. You can also subscribe to my email list there and you'll be among the first to know.
Great.
And if you sign up for my email list, you get a bunch of free downloadable path workings as well.
Cool. And whatever's available when it comes out, I'll make sure that makes it in the notes too. So cool. Awesome. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks so much. This has been delightful. It's just great catching up with you, Victoria.
You too.
Cheers.
WitchLit is a production of Thousand Volt Press and is edited by Julian Rashke. Our intro music is Cosmic Glow by Andrew Kay, and our outro music is Voices by Alexander Shenekhar. Transcripts and all our previous episodes are available at witchlitpod.com, and you can follow us on Instagram and Threads at witchlitpod. Please help other witches find us by leaving a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening to and reading WitchLit.